Alright, welcome to this super in-depth look at Nykthos ramp in Pioneer. So just to briefly go over what this deck is about, the whole game plan is to build up green pips or green devotion via a bunch of permanents to eventually make a ton of mana using Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. We're going to use Cavalier of Thorns to find Nykthoses and storm the festival, and then storm the festival to find our other pieces, primarily looking for Karn the Great Creator and Kiora, so that Kiora can untap Nykthos for more mana, and Karn can go find combo-based artifacts from the sideboard. And eventually we will assemble a game-winning infinite loop that involves Kiora, Karn, Nykthos, and specific artifacts from the sideboard in order to win. So before that, you may recall that I made a video previously where didn't I say that Nykthos ramp sucks? If you'll recall, I made this video about it, and I stand behind everything I said here, but with that said, yeah. So, okay, first we're going to go over how the combo works. So basically, you need Nykthos to be able to generate 14 mana, so you need 14 green pips on the battlefield. You need 2 Kioras, and you need 2 Karn the Great Creators. So in order to step through this one at a time, I'll explain how the loop works. So basically, you're going to get Restorative Burst from the sideboards. Now, the front side of Restorative Burst is Pestilent Cauldron, and since that front side is an artifact, Karn is able to retrieve it, but then you're going to cast the back side, which is Restorative Burst. So essentially what you want to do is you cast Restorative Burst and it returns up to 2 creatures, lands, or planeswalkers from your graveyard to your hand. Each player gains 4 life, and then importantly, it exiles itself. So what you're going to do is generate a bunch of mana with Nykthos. You're going to use Kiora to untap Nykthos to generate more mana. You're going to use Karn to go fetch Restorative Burst from the sideboard. And then as long as you have a second Kiora and a second Karn in the graveyard, Restorative Burst can grab the second one from the graveyard. Then you're going to replay them, and with your new Kiora, you untap Nykthos again. And with your new Karn, you get Restorative Burst back from exile again. And in order to do this, you need 14 mana because you need 2 mana for Nykthos to activate it. You need 3 mana to cast Kiora. You need 4 mana to cast Karn, and you need 5 mana to cast Restorative Burst. So, if you have 14 Devotion, you'll break even on mana, but you will gain infinite life with Restorative Burst. So specifically, it works out to this. 14 mana equals infinite life, and if you have 15 or more mana, that equals infinite green mana as well. So once you have infinite life and infinite green mana, how exactly are you actually winning the game? So with the infinite mana / life, you can cast Pestilent Cauldron on its front side, and then Pestilent Cauldron's second ability says, each opponent mills cards equal to the amount of life you gained this turn, and since you're gaining infinite life with Restorative Burst, you can mill your opponent infinitely. Now, this does require that you have black mana to play Pestilent Cauldron, which can be an issue that I'll bring up later. There are ways of getting Pestilent Cauldron into play without black mana, but they're incredibly convoluted and unlikely to work. So this brings up an alternate combo, or rather it's an alternate route to the same combo that involves the Chain Veil. So with the Chain Veil, you need fewer pieces starting off, and you need fewer devotion and less mana starting off. So if you have the Chain Veil, 2 Kioras, 1 Karn, and Nykthos that can produce 8 devotion, and you have 4 extra mana to start with, you can go on an infinite combo with just this. You do still need to grab Restorative Burst with Karn eventually, but Chain Veil can get you there. So, here are the steps, and I know this looks incredibly complicated, so we're going to go through it really fast first, and then I'll slow down and go through it step by step. So step 1, you activate Nykthos. You have 8 mana plus the 2 mana left over because you have 4 mana to start with. You have Kiora untapping Nykthos in step 2. Step 3, you activate Nykthos again to go to 16 mana. Step 4, you Karn for the Chain Veil. Step 5, you cast the Chain Veil going to 12 mana. Step 6, you activate the Chain Veil going to 8 mana. Step 7, you use Kiora to untap the Chain Veil. Step 8, you activate the Chain Veil again going to 4 mana. Step 9, Kiora untaps Nykthos. Step 10, activate Nykthos going to 10 mana. Step 11, Karn gets Restorative Burst from the sideboard. Step 12, you cast Restorative Burst retrieving Kiora number 2 and go to 5 mana. Step 13, you cast the second Kiora going to 2 mana. Step 14, the new Kiora untaps Nykthos. Step 15, you activate Nykthos going to 8 mana. Step 16, Kiora untaps Nykthos. Step 17, you activate Nykthos going to 14 mana. Step 18, you untap the Chain Veil. Step 19, you activate Chain Veil going to 10 mana. Step 20, you untap the Chain Veil. Step 21, you activate Chain Veil again going to 6 mana. Step 22, you untap Nykthos. Step 23, you activate Nykthos going to 12 mana. And then step 24, you repeat from step 11, going through the same sequence, casting Burst going down 5 mana and casting Kiora going down 3 mana, so that you have 4 mana left over. So to slow that down, basically what's happening is that the Chain Veil is giving extra activations to your Planeswalkers, and notably, it applies to Planeswalkers that you cast afterward. So the first Planeswalkers that you're going to have in play are Kiora and Karn, but every Planeswalker that you cast after that, including the second Kiora, is going to have additional activations based on how many times you activated the Chain Veil. So going back to the start, we have 8 Devotion, and we have 4 extra mana from Forests, Llanowar Elves, whatever. We're going to activate Nykthos, so we have 4 extra mana lying around. We spend 2 of that on Nykthos, we gain 8 Devotion mana, and we have an extra 2 lying around. Step 2, we use Kiora to untap Nykthos, so now we have 10 mana. Step 3, we activate Nykthos again, so we go down 2, but then back up 8, so we're at 16. We use Karn to get the Chain Veil out of the sideboard. We cast the Chain Veil, so that's -4, going down to 12 mana. We activate the Chain Veil, going down to 8 mana, and now our Planeswalkers have +1 activations. So now we use our Kiora to untap the Chain Veil. We activate the Chain Veil again, going down to 4 mana. Then we use Kiora to untap Nykthos, because if we use it to untap Chain Veil and activate Chain Veil again, we'll be out of mana, so we activate Nykthos instead, going back up to 10. Karn now has an extra activation after fetching the Chain Veil. He actually has 2 extra activations, so we -2 again, putting Karn at 1 loyalty, and we go get Restorative Burst from the sideboard. So we cast Restorative Burst, and we get the second Kiora out of our graveyard, and we go to 5 mana. We cast the second Kiora and we go to 2 mana, which leaves us just enough to activate Nykthos again. Now the new Kiora has 3 activations. It has its original activation and it has 2 extra activations from the Chain Veil. So we untap Nykthos, and we activate Nykthos and we go back up to 8. Then Kiora can untap Nykthos again because she still has more activations. So we activate Nykthos again and we go to 14 because we go -2 + 8, we go to 14. Then we have a final activation on Kiora, so we untap the Chain Veil. We activate the Chain Veil again, going to 10 mana. We untap the Chain Veil again with Kiora using that extra activation. We activate the Chain Veil again, going to 6 mana. And now with the last activation of Kiora, we untap Nykthos, and then we can activate Nykthos going back up to 12 mana. And now Karn has multiple extra activations, so we can plus Karn multiple times and then minus to get Restorative Burst back. Or if Karn dies, we can get it back with Restorative Burst anyway. So either plus Karn up to the point where you can then minus it and it sticks on the board, or plus it and minus it, put it back in the graveyard, and then Restorative Burst gets it. And at this point, we go back to step number 11, where Karn is getting back Burst, and we're getting back Kiora and Karn. But every Kiora and Karn that we're getting back has multiple extra activations. So at this point, Kiora has 5, 6, 7 extra activations. So at this point, you can just continuously untap Nykthos and Chain Veil as needed to gain more and more and more mana. And from there, you're going to transition from this Chain Veil loop back into the original Burst loop to go an infinite life, and then use Pestilent Cauldron to win. And as you can see, we have the Chain Veil giving extra activations to Karn, so we can alternate back and forth between plus and minus, and get back Restorative Burst as needed. So this unlocks a separate win condition, and this condition does not require us to have black mana, and that's using the Stone Brain to strip the opponent's deck apart. So basically, the Stone Brain exiles itself when you use it, so you can always keep getting it back with Karn. So with the Stone Brain, you can name something that your opponent definitely doesn't have in their deck, so that way you get to look at their hand and their deck. Then you can name anything that's not in their hand but is in their deck to exile the cards out of their deck. And then on the last activation, you can name a card that's in their hand and then start forcing them to draw into an empty library, or just exile everything out of their hand and library and leave them with 0 cards and pass the turn. Either way, they mill out and they either die from drawing off the Stone Brain, or they die when you pass the turn and they go to draw. And specifically, the advantage of this is that you do not require black mana in order to cast Pestilent Cauldron. So now that I've talked about the combos, let's go to the individual card breakdown. So first of all, there's Nykthos, and this is obviously the linchpin of the deck. The deck doesn't function without Nykthos, but even outside of combos, you can use Nykthos to just generate a ton of mana and put a bunch of permanents into play. Then we have the mana ramp / devotion enablers. So there's Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves and Wolfwillow Haven. And these are the cards that are going to help you ramp out and speed up so that you can hit Kiora, Karn, and your other big mana payoffs faster than normal. And they incidentally give 1 green pip each, so they count towards the devotion for Nykthos. And specifically talking about the individual cards a little bit more, so just to get into some of the tips and tricks for the cards, you may think that it's good to put Wolfwillow Haven on Nykthos. After all, you're tapping and untapping Nykthos over and over with Kiora anyway, so why don't you just put Wolfwillow Haven on it so that you generate another mana? And the reason that you do not do this is because most of the time when you're comboing off, you're going to be hitting extra copies of Nykthos, whether that be from getting them off of Cavalier of Thorns, putting them into play with Storm the Festival, or finding them when you get cards from Kiora and Invasion of Ixalan, and then just playing a second Nykthos as normal, you're going to be playing extra copies of Nykthos during your combo turns. And if Wolfwillow Haven is on Nykthos, then when you legend rule the old one out, the Wolfwillow Haven will go with it. So you almost never put Wolfwillow Haven on Nykthos. Now, talking further about Wolfwillow Haven, what about this ability to make a wolf token? When do we use this? Well, the answer is we don't use it very often because generally you want the extra mana that Wolfwillow Haven is giving either by its own triggered ability from being on a land and from the green pip that Nykthos is getting a devotion off of. So most of the time you do not want to make a wolf, but there are times when you do want to make a wolf. They're pretty few and they're usually when you're behind and not in a good position. So one is when you need to crew Sky Sovereign. If you have a wolf token and like a Lenore Elves, you can get up to the 3 crew that you need to crew Sky Sovereign. Another time is if you just need more defense. So for example, you need to have a blocker for Karn or Kiora, but primarily Karn, you can make a wolf token in order to do that. This is almost always a bad trade-off because you want to keep Wolfwillow Haven around so that you can explode on mana with Nykthos, but sometimes you do it. And notably, there is a timing restriction on this ability, which is that although you can do it sort of at instant speed, you can only do it on your own turn. So you cannot do it on your opponent's turn after you see what they do. So let's talk about Old Growth Troll next. Now, Old Growth Troll has 3 green pips for devotion, but notably, this alone wouldn't be enough. And I want to stress this point. Just having multiple green pips for Nykthos isn't enough of a reason to play a card just by itself. However, Old Growth Troll makes up for this in a number of ways. So first of all, it's a decent blocker as a 4/4, but particularly it has when it dies, so if it's being killed through combat or removal spells like Fatal Push, Dreadbore, or damage, anything that doesn't exile it, it dies, but it returns as a aura that enchants a forest, and it gives that forest add double green by tapping it, and you can also sacrifice it to make another troll token. So specifically, even if your opponent kills it, it will come back and be a triple green source for Nykthos' devotion anyway. And in particular, Old Growth Troll is actually usually better as the aura form because it's giving you an additional mana by letting you tap that land for 2. Now on top of that, Old Growth Troll has some other utility in that it triggers Kiora to draw a card, and it's able to crew Sky Sovereign. Also, sometimes you can use the Troll Warrior that it makes to also trigger Kiora to draw a card. Now, like Wolfwillow Haven, where you don't want to use it most of the time because it's contributing to your devotion and adding a mana, Old Growth Troll is the same way. You usually do not want to sacrifice it to make that Troll Warrior, and the times that you do are primarily either for Kiora or Sky Sovereign when you're behind or not in a very good position. And speaking of Old Growth Troll and Wolfwillow Haven, you usually don't want to put them on the same land. Now, sometimes you do, and that's usually when you don't already have Nykthos, but you usually don't because on the chance that you actually do activate Old Growth Troll's sacrifice ability, you don't want to have to sacrifice a land that Wolfwillow Haven is also attached to. So again, usually put them on different forests. Also, Old Growth Troll, unlike Wolfwillow Haven, can actually be activated at instant speed, although the Troll Warrior token enters the battlefield tapped, so you won't be able to use it as a blocker initially. So then there's Cavalier of Thorns, and this is one of the backbones of the deck because it's specifically, its ability is doing multiple things. So first of all, it milling you 5 and then finding a land is very important for attempting to find Nykthos, but it's also important because it helps put Storm the Festivals in the graveyard so that you can flash them back. One big problem with this deck is that you have this issue where half the cards in the deck are ramp cards and the other half of the deck are your combo pieces that you use to actually go off, and sometimes you don't draw one half or the other. Cavalier helps you get those Storm the Festivals into your graveyard so that you can start digging for your combo pieces. And of course, incidentally, Cavalier of Thorns also triggers Kiora's draw ability because it has 5 power. So specifically, if you have Kiora already in play when you cast Cavalier, its trigger and Kiora's trigger will both go on the stack, and you can choose the order that you put them in. It's usually correct to just draw the card first with Kiora because then you get additional information. Also, I guess it takes another card out of your deck so you're more likely to hit Nykthos off of the mill. Another thing that you'll do a lot of the time is that you'll play Cavalier of Thorns, and then before its mill ability resolves, you want to activate a Nykthos if you already have one in play, because if you hit a second Nykthos with Cavalier, you'll have to legend rule the first one out. So you want to get as much mana off the first Nykthos as possible before you put the second one into play. So let's talk about Storm the Festival. Now, Storm the Festival is this deck's Collected Company in a sense. It's the card that's going to help you find the pieces that you need. However, like Collected Company has this problem where it can brick, where it basically hits nothing of value. And essentially what you always want want to hit off Storm the Festival is Kiora, Karn, Cavalier, or Nykthos. Sometimes Old Growth Troll can be useful just in terms of if it hits a Kiora trigger, but basically these 4 cards are the ones you want to hit off of Storm the Festival, and if you're hitting anything else with Storm, it's not what you want. Because of its mana value 5 restriction, it does increase the want of mana value 5 cards in your deck, so anything that costs more than 5 is going to be a lot less desirable for the deck to play. So like Cavalier and how you want to activate Nykthos before its ability resolves, you've got the same deal with Storm, where if you already have a Kiora, Karn, or Nykthos in play, you usually want to activate them before you Storm, because if you hit a second copy of any of these cards, you want to have already used them before you have to Legend Rule the first one out. So then there's the question of, let's say you have the mana to cast either Storm or another card in your hand like Cavalier, for example. Which one should you cast? And the answer is, I would usually err on the side of casting the sure thing, because Storm the Festival can and will brick on you. So if you have the option between casting, say, Storm or Cavalier, I would almost always err on just casting Cavalier first and then setting up for the Storm next turn. However, sometimes you won't have that luxury and you'll be maybe a turn away from losing the game against, say, an aggro deck, and so you just have to cast Storm and try to combo off that turn. And lastly, there's a little quirk with Storm where if you already have a Kiora in play and you Storm into a second Kiora and something that triggers Kiora, like a Cavalier or an Old Growth Troll, both of the Kioras will actually trigger even though you're Legend Ruling one of them out. So if you have Kiora already in play and you Storm into Kiora Cavalier, you draw 2 cards. Now, of course, next let's talk about the main combo pieces, and those are Karn and Kiora. So, of course, these are the cards that you need in order to enable your Nykthos, Chain Veil, Restorative Burst combo loops in order to win the game. But these cards do also have secondary uses outside of that. So Karn, of course, has an entire wishboard of artifacts to tutor for, which can be useful in various situations even outside of comboing, and I'll get to that later. Karn can also use his +1 to essentially cruise Sky Sovereign. Now, it makes Sky Sovereign only have 5 power, but it does mean that you can cruise Sky Sovereign for an entire turn cycle even without having a creature to crew it. Now, in terms of Karn animating artifacts, Sky Sovereign is really the only one that you ever use the plus ability on. The other artifacts, usually you don't want to plus them because you want their effects and you don't want them to be susceptible to removal. The only exception is when you're in a racing situation where you're very likely to be able to lose the game on short notice, so you just need to beat your opponent down as fast as possible. And Kiora, of course, draws you cards when you play creatures with power 4 or greater, and the untap can be useful even in other cases. So for example, you can have sequences where you do things like you play a land and an elf on turn 1, and then you can play a land and then Kiora, and you can put Wolfwillow Havens on your lands and then use Kiora to untap those Wolfwillow Havens in order to get ahead on mana, even when you don't have Nykthos. And in some circumstances, you can attack with a creature and then untap it. Now, specifically, if you're ever in the position where you're untapping something besides Nykthos in order to get mana, always untap a land rather than a creature, because that way the opponent can't use a removal spell to kill your elf, whereas if you untap a land, you'll be able to just tap it again without fear of removal. So next there's Cityscape Leveler, and the reason I'm talking about this right now is because a lot of players have taken to playing this in the main deck and sideboard as well, but also the main deck. So the question is, why would you want this in the main deck instead of just your sideboard for Karn to go retrieve? Well, the answer is this solves a number of issues that the deck has where you just need an ability to answer certain permanents. Additionally, Cityscape Lever also has the ability to be unearthed from the graveyard when you mill it over with Cavalier of Thorns. So in that regard, it has a little bit more utility than just being an 8 mana big bomb thing. Also, an interesting part of Cityscape Leveler is that because you can unearth it, the unearth ability exiles it after it attacks, so you can get it back with Karn. Unfortunately, it's 8 mana, so you can't get it off of Storm the Festival, but having a 1-of copy does have its uses. So next we're going to talk about Invasion of Ixalan. Now this is the slot that used to be Oath of Nissa, and so the idea is you have a cheap permanent that adds a green devotion, but it helps you dig towards the other pieces that you need like Karn, Kiora, etc. So obviously the value of Oath of Nissa over Invasion of Ixalan is that Oath of Nissa only costs 1, whereas Invasion costs 2, and obviously 2 is more than 1, it's twice as much in fact. But in this deck, the difference between the 2 and 1 mana for these effects is actually not that different, whereas Invasion's abilities are much better in every other regard. So first of all, since Oath of Nissa is legendary, you would have to legend rule any additional copies you play, whereas you can continue to play additional copies of Invasion to add more green for the devotion for Nykthos. Secondly, digging 5 cards deep is a lot better than digging 3 cards deep. And on top of that, Invasion can randomly get permanents that Oath of Nissa can't, so for example, Wolfwillow Haven. And if you side in artifacts from the sideboard, you can get those as well, whereas Oath of Nissa cannot. Now on top of all that, Invasion also has uses when you flip it over, so you do have creatures in the deck that can hit Invasion for the full amount to flip it immediately, including Old Growth Troll, Cavalier of Thorns, and Sky Sovereign sometimes. Now, having a 4/3 trample that is pseudo-indestructible is not terribly useful, but having this 4-power creature does actually trigger Kiora because you exile and cast the battle on its backside. It doesn't just flip over. So sometimes getting this creature is relevant. It does suck that the backside loses the green devotion because it doesn't have the green pip anymore, but sometimes it's worthwhile if you can trigger Kiora to draw another card. So next let's talk about the land base of the deck besides Nykthos, and this is going to be pretty straightforward. We have lots and lots of forests, and then a few Boseijus and Lair of the Hydra. So specifically, Boseiju is of course useful in all the ways Boseiju usually is. It has some prime targets like Parhelion and Thespian Stage and whatnot, but primarily you're running it because it's essentially a free green source. It's not tremendously useful. Sometimes it comes in clutch to save you, but again, you're playing it mostly because it's free. I would play 2 copies in general. I think 3 copies is too many, and 1 copy you can get away with playing 2. You're usually not going to have exactly both Boseijus in your hand. Now, Lair of the Hydra on the other hand, so this land is actually not terribly useful. The deck is not really interested in a beatdown plan. Almost all of the time you're winning via combo, so being able to turn this land into a creature is not terribly useful. That said, it does sometimes come in handy. So for example, if you are able to make a ton of mana but not necessarily infinite, you can one-shot your opponent with Lair of the Hydra if they have no blockers, or maybe you're playing against a deck like Blue-White Control and you can animate this to attack their Planeswalkers. But again, in general, it's not going to be terribly useful. It's also not very good on defense, since most of the time you won't have enough mana to put into it to make it a reasonable blocker, and also a lot of the time, if you're generating a lot of mana, it's via Nykthos on your own turn to cast things, and then you don't have a lot left over in order to animate this. I see a lot of players play 2 copies of Lair, and I think that's wrong. You do want this effect, but you don't want it enough to have this land enter tapped when you really need it, so I think 1 copy is fine. And outside of that, there really isn't any lands that you want to play in the deck besides Boseiju, Lair, basic forests, and Nykthos, of course. So next let's talk about the sideboard cards, and sideboard is kind of a misnomer here. It's not really a sideboard because most of the cards you're playing here are Carnival artifacts. They are cards that you're going to get via Karn's -2 ability, and they're not really meant to be sideboard cards, so we're going to evaluate them in that sense. So first of all, there's of course Restorative Burst and the Chain Veil, which are necessary for combos, but Restorative Burst can also sometimes just be used as a value piece. So for example, if you have Karn, but you don't have the mana to start going off on a combo, or maybe you don't even have Kiora, you can fetch Restorative Burst and just use it as a value piece to get cards back, especially if you're not sure whether Karn's going to be able to survive. In fact, most of the time, if I don't need a specific card for a particular situation, I'm just going to go grab Restorative Burst by default, since it sets me up for having the combo next turn or getting Karn back if he dies. So next let's move on to the threats and answers that you can get from the sideboard. So pretty stock Cityscape Leveler out of the sideboard. We already discussed it in the earlier section, but again, you just have this card to answer basically any permanent that you need other than land. So other than that, you can basically deal with whatever you need. Now, Sky Sovereign is good for answering mostly creatures, especially out of the aggro decks, and it's of course cheaper than Cityscape Leveler, so that's good when you don't have exactly 8 mana, but maybe you have 5. Especially if you don't have Nykthos, you might have 4 mana to play Karn, and the next turn you play another land and you're able to play Sky Sovereign. And specifically, Sky Sovereign is also really good for being able to crew it and attack and basically pick off more than just one threat at a time. Now, I also include Portal to Phyrexia here. This is a card I have not really seen any people play. I like it because it bails you out of situations that the other single target answers do not. So for example, if you're being aggro rushed by a whole bunch of aggressive creatures, Portal eats 3 of them, and that can be enough, whereas maybe Cityscape or Sky Sovereign just killing 1 thing isn't enough. Also, even against like mid-range decks such as Rakdos, for example, sometimes either one of these cards is not enough to really swing the game in your favor. So for example, maybe you get Sky Sovereign or Cityscape Leveler and then they kill it, and then you just don't have a good enough board presence even with these cards to get over them, whereas Portal will just come down, eat a bunch of their guys, and then start reanimating stuff on your side of the field over and over, and that'll pretty much close out the game. And then of course we have our Silver Bullet / other answers that are not really threats on their own. So starting off, we've got Haywire Might, which just takes out any artifacts or enchantments that we need to hit. So for example, Portable Hole, Enigmatic Incarnation, sometimes Parhelion. Now specifically it specifies non-creature artifacts and enchantments, so you cannot use it to hit Xenagos, but it will hit these other cards, so it's just another thing that you can use to answer these type of effects. Then we've got the Stone Brain, which is for combo decks. We can strip out Indomitable Creativity, Karn in the Mirror, Atraxa, any decks like that where they're relying on specifically one card to really win the game. We can use the Stone Brain to take those out. And then we've got Karn Sylex, which we can use to stop aggro decks. Now, there's a big problem with Karn Sylex, and that's, first of all, it's 3 mana. We might not have enough mana to cast Karn and Karn Sylex in the same turn. Even if we are able to, Karn Sylex then enters the battlefield tapped, so we still have to wait another turn unless we have Kiora to untap it. And then we're paying X, exiling it, and destroying the non-land permanents with mana value X or less, which includes our own permanents. So for example, if we're playing against aggro and we have Wolfwillow Havens, we have Elvish Mystic, this is going to blow up all of our own cards. And we're usually probably going to have to pay X's at least 3 to kill all the aggro creatures. That's going to blow up Kiora as well. So it is setting us back in order to use this, but sometimes it's what we need to bail us out of a big aggro board. And really, Pioneer does not have a lot of good options for stopping aggro decks that are artifacts. There's no Ensnaring Bridge or any cards like that, so this is the best we're going to get in terms of slowing down aggro. And additionally, like the Stone Brain, it exiles itself when you use it, so you can fetch it back with Karn and use it again if you need to. So then a few more silver bullets. So we've got Pithing Needle. This just stops whatever activated abilities you need, like Teferi, like Reflection of Kiki-Jiki once they flipped it over. Sometimes they're going to kill you in one turn with Reflection and you can just needle it to stop them. Sometimes you can shut off Thespian Stage from copying Lotus Field. And you can also use it to name cards that are in people's hands, so it can stop Boseiju, Otawara, etc. It's not tremendously useful, and of course there's plenty of answers to the needle, but sometimes it's just what you need. Now then there's also Damping Sphere, and Damping Sphere is for exactly the Lotus Field deck. Now you might ask, well, we already have the Stone Brain, why don't we just use the Stone Brain to stop Lotus Field? And the problem is, first of all, they may have Lotus Field in play already, so you can't Stone Brain it. Secondly, Lotus Field has usually multiple different win cons, especially after sideboarding, so there's no specific card that you can name with the Stone Brain that'll stop them. You can't just name Emergent Ultimatum or Mastermind's Acquisition, because they're going to have other cards that can still beat you. And one more thing is that sometimes you've got 6 mana to go Karn, fetch Damping Sphere and cast it, but you don't have 8 mana to go fetch the Stone Brain and activate it in the same turn. And if you're 1 turn away from losing the Lotus Field, you need an answer right now and cast Damping Sphere to stop them. Now that's only a temporary measure because they do have Boseiju and Otawara to get rid of Damping Sphere and some other cards from the sideboard, usually like Terra Sunder, but it will slow them down in general. Now, of course, we have God-Pharaoh Statue. God-Pharaoh Statue has a number of uses, but it's basically the best single artifact that you can grab when you have nothing else that you specifically need to grab. So in a lot of cases, this additional 2 mana tax on the opponent's spells will slow them down tremendously no matter what deck they are. So you can, for example, grab this in addition to Damping Sphere in order to slow down Lotus Field. It's hugely problematic for, Izzet Phoenix to deal with. And just any deck in general, if you manage to get a lot of mana really quickly to Karn into this, but you don't quite have enough mana to combo, you can grab God-Pharaoh's Statue and just use this as a stacks piece to slow your opponent down tremendously. The 1 life loss on end step doesn't really matter too much. It's primarily this 2 mana tax that you're interested in. This is also the prime example that I have for why you do not want to plus Karn on a artifact. So for example, when you have this out, it might look very tempting to use this. So, you know, you plus Karn on it and it becomes a 6/6 creature that's also causing your opponent to lose 1 life. But in general, the stacks effect that you're getting from it is a lot more valuable than risking having it be able to die to creature-based removal. So then there's Graveyard Hate. Now this is primarily going to be Tormod's Crypt, but you can play other things like Unlicensed Hearse, Soul Guide Lantern, whatever. But in general, we're just going to talk about Graveyard Hate. So there's a couple of decks in Pioneer that you would think would be useful for Graveyard Hate, but they're not actually that good. So one is, of course, the Delve spells. So Treasure Cruise and Temporal Trespass out of Phoenix, and Tasigur and Hooting Mandrills out of Neoform Atraxa. And then, of course, Greasefang being able to reanimate Parhelion, and it can also stop them from using Can't Stay Away on Greasefang or other creatures. So you might think, isn't that great? You want Graveyard Hate, why isn't this good? So the problem is, in decks like Phoenix and Neoform Atraxa, they just have way too many ways to fill up their graveyard too easily. So if you're trying to stop Treasure Cruise, if you're trying to stop Temporal Trespass, they just have too many cheap cantrips and spells like Pieces of the Puzzle that are going to just dump tons and tons of cards into their graveyard. So at best, you're maybe slowing them down 1 or 2 turns, but they're just getting find their delve spells and enough fodder for them eventually. And it's the same basic concept with Neoform Atraxa. And in the case of Greasefang, if you have Tormod's Crypt, that means you also have Karn in play because you needed Karn in order to get this. And if you have Karn in play, then they can't crew Parhelion anyway, so it's kind of not useful. So now that we've talked about most of the artifacts that you have in your sideboards, let's talk about when do you actually side in anything, because most of the cards are going to be devoted to wish targets for Karn. So in general, it's going to be when Karn getting them is too slow. So some prime examples are Sky Sovereign versus the aggro decks. You want Sky Sovereign in order to kill the aggro creatures, but paying 9 mana in order to cast Karn and go fetch Sky Sovereign and then pay another 5 to cast it is usually too much. And you're usually better off just having it in the main deck, especially since then you can Storm the Festival into it. And the same is true in other decks like Greasefang, where cards like Tormod's Crypt, Haywire Might, and Pithing Needle are somewhat slow if you're just Karning into them, but also against Greasefang, if you have Karn in play anyway, that means they can't crew their artifacts regardless, so you may as well move these pieces to the main board so that you just have answers in case they get their Greasefang online before you can find Karn. Now, the one exception to that is when you have Karn, but you don't have a good way to block for it. So you have Karn in play, but it doesn't really matter because they're just going to attack Karn and then return Parhelion to play next turn anyway. They might also have some spell that can kill it, like maybe they're playing Assassin's Trophy. So sometimes it's worthwhile to just leave Tormod's Crypt or something in the sideboard so you can get it and have double protection with it and Karn. But in general, you're moving these cards into the main deck when you have matchups like that. So these are the general principles. It's basically when having Karn means that the cards either don't matter or Karn is too slow. So let's get to the main issue here, and that's the reason that I made that downfall of mono green video in the first place, which is the aggro problem. And this is that Nykthos ramp is egregiously bad against basically any aggro deck. Now, of course, every deck has its good and bad matchups, but Nykthos ramp is really, really bad against any form of aggro. And even the matchups where Nykthos ramp is good, or at least 50-50 against, do not make up for how bad the aggro matchup is. So what is the main issue? Well, the main issue is that the aggro decks are too fast and they go too wide to deal with. So specifically in the red decks, you have creatures with haste, creatures that put tokens or just like go really wide in or pump the whole team. So cards like Battlecry Goblin or Castle Embereth. And then they have reach with burn spells. So even if you have blockers, it doesn't matter because they can just burn you out. Now, white has a ton of problems. So they have exile-based removal in cards like Brutal Cathar or Declaration in Stone, where the death triggers on your old growth trolls and cavaliers don't apply anymore. They have Brave the Elements, so even if you have blockers, they can just Brave name green and attack everything into you. And they have Stax pieces that slow down your combos, so they have things like Thalia and Redain to tax your Storm the Festivals and Planeswalkers, and cards like Archon of Emeria, which just completely shut down your ability to combo off. They may also have cards like Containment Priest that stop Storm the Festival from putting creatures into play. So white just has a ton of issues to fight through. And with blue, which is usually spirits-based decks, they have cards like Mausoleum Wanderer to essentially tax your spells in the same way that Thalia would. They have straight-up counter spells from cards like Geistlight Snare and Spell Queller, and Shacklegeist is a huge problem because even if you have blockers, it taps them down. And regardless of which color or type of deck that you're playing against, you might think that big blockers are a good way to solve this problem, but they just go way too wide. So first, they'll just attack you really quickly, get you down to a fairly low life total, and then even if you have blockers like Old Growth Troll or Cavalier, they just go way too wide on the board and you just cannot block enough things to prevent yourself from losing. And their aggro plan is typically faster than your combo plan. So let's talk about the potential solutions to the aggro problem and why these don't work. So of course the first is big blockers, so Old Growth Troll, Lovestruck Beast, especially because it can make a human token, which means that you have 2 separate blockers, one of which is white so that it protects you somewhat from Brave the Elements out of the white decks. And more recently we've got Pelucranos, which obviously looks great. It's got triple green pips, it's big on defense, it has reach so it can block the spirits and angels and other flying creatures, and then it has this big transform ability that it turns it into essentially a Wormcoil engine with 6 power of lifelink. So surely all of these cards are good answers to the aggro decks. And the issue is not really. So your deck doesn't have enough of these blockers to actually reasonably block them. They just go way too wide, and eventually they'll just attack you with enough creatures that it doesn't matter how you block, you're going to take lethal anyway. It also really sucks on Phyrexian that flipping it into this Wormcoil version strips the Nykthos ramp pips out of it, so that you don't have the devotion anymore when it's on its backside. And yes, as hard as it is to believe, even with a 6/6 lifelinker, sometimes they can just attack you with enough creatures that it doesn't matter that you have this. So the next idea is, okay, use lots and lots of blockers. If they're going too wide, if that's the problem, then just play cards that go wide as well. And the issue here is that there actually aren't that many options in Pioneer for go wide single cards, and the best options I've been able to find are either Hornet Queen or Ishkanah. And there's problems with both of these cards. Hornet Queen is of course very expensive at 7 mana, and of course at 7 mana that means you can't storm the festival into it. And with Ishkanah, you don't reliably have Delirium even with Cavalier milling yourself for a bunch of cards, so you cannot reliably get these spider tokens. And I would say even if you manage to get these cards out, there's still plenty of answers to them, especially if you're using a bunch of the same tokens, Declaration and Stone out of the white decks. They can still brave the elements past you. They still have the ability to get around putting blockers into play. So okay, if we can't play enough blockers to stop them, maybe we can kill their creatures. So we've got Sky Reaping as a way to take out flying creatures, so specifically from decks like Spirits or Angels where all of their creatures fly, why don't we play Sky Reaping as a 2-mana Wrath to get rid of those creatures? And Sky Reaping is actually a good answer to these decks. They do have ways of getting around it, so of course if they're in blue they can always counterspell it, and if they have Selfless Spirit they can of course make their creatures indestructible so you can't kill them, but this is essentially a 2-mana Wrath for those decks, so this is actually a good answer to Spirits and Angels. The problem is, it's not an answer to any of the other aggro decks. Your sideboard slots are limited, you're spending most of them on Karn Wishboard targets. Can you really afford to have these cards that specifically hit flying decks only and not the other aggro decks? So next is straight up fighting effect. So okay, let's just kill their creatures regardless of what they are. So examples would be cards like Tail Swipe, where you spend a mana and you have your creatures fight theirs. So what is the problem with playing fight effect? Well, you don't actually have that many big creatures. You're going to have 4 copies of Old Growth Troll and 4 copies of Cavalier, which at 5 mana are kind of slow in order to deal with these aggro decks. And then all the other cards in your decks are 1/1 elves that do not fight very well. And maybe you have like Phyrexian or Lovestruck Beast, so you have a few extra big creatures, but for the most part you don't have enough big creatures for this to be reliable. There are also creatures in Pioneer that straight up fight things, but there's not that many of them and they're pretty bad. So another option is life gain, so cards like Citizen Petitioner, where you're gaining life and incidentally adding devotion for Nykthos. And the problem is you just don't gain enough life for this to matter. So with Citizen Petitioner, you're usually probably gaining maybe like 6 life off of it if you're playing it in a timely manner to try to fight aggro decks, and it's obviously not blocking very well at all as a 2/2. Now there's other cards that are similar to this, but they're all basically doing the same thing, where they're a pretty dinky effect that's not actually gaining you enough life to be relevant, not blocking well, not really doing what you need in order to survive against aggro. So another option is fogs. So the best fog is probably Haze of Pollen, since it's a fog, or you can just cycle it away if you're, in your combo turn and you don't need a fog. This is a reasonable effect to use if you're only trying to survive for a turn or two in order to then combo off. Again, the problem is this isn't actually dealing with anything that you need to. So if you can't combo the turn after you fog, then this didn't do anything. And also, if they have any creatures that you really need to deal with, like Mausoleum Wanderer, Thalia, any of these like Stax creatures, this isn't actually killing those. And then the next is the most radical solution of all of them, which is completely change the mana base to include a second color and then play non-green removal. And this is something that I did try as well, where I put in a bunch of black mana and then I played Fatal Push and Ritual of Soot. So what's the problem with doing this? Well, first of all, yet again, you don't have that many extra sideboard slots. You do have a bunch of slots taken up by artifacts that you need to fetch with Karn, so you can't play too many of these cards, and that means that these cards are not consistent enough. It also means that these cards are not contributing towards your main combo game plan, so they're diluting your deck so that you don't have the ability to go off as consistently. And then it also makes your mana base worse, so now you have lands that are potentially entering tapped, you have lands that are hurting you, which is the exact opposite thing that you wanted against the aggro aggro decks. And then also sometimes Old Growth Troll's ability to enchant a forest matters, and Old Growth Troll specifically enchants a forest, not any other land. So by filling your deck with these non-forest lands, you're sometimes making it so that Old Growth Troll has nothing to enchant, and when it dies, it just dies for good. So let's talk about some other commonly played cards that get put into these decks that I think you shouldn't play, because at least in my experience, they have not really made the deck better. The primary one is Sylvan Caryatid, and that's basically just to have another source of ramp outside of Wolfwillow Haven. And the issue here is really just going to be a numbers game. So Wolfwillow Haven is specifically good as a card that is ramping you and is not able to be killed. And Sylvan Caryatid, for the most part, can't be killed because of hexproof, although there are some things that can kill it, like sweepers. But for the most part, it's not going to die either. The main difference is that you would just much rather have 1 mana ramp rather than 2 mana ramp. So the Elves are always going to be better than the 2 mana ramp that you could potentially have. And Wolfwillow Haven specifically works really well as a thing that you can put on a land and then untap with Kiora, whereas you don't have the same thing with Sylvan Caryatid. And the 0-3 stats are really not very good for blocking. So when Sylvan Caryatid does get played, it's usually only as a 1 or 2 of, and it's reasonable to play this card, but I don't think you really want it. Another card that often sees play is Nissa, Who Shakes the World, and this is so that you can get a bunch more mana going. Now, it doesn't actually add a bunch more for Nykthos specifically, but it does give you a bunch of mana boost in terms of your forests tapping for extra mana, so if the issue is just casting a bunch of stuff to begin with, it can accelerate you. The problem is, once again, this is just another thing that's not actually going towards your combo plan, and when you're drawing this card, it means you're not drawing another card that could have been your combo plan. So obviously, if you already have Karn Kiora, then Nissa is great, but when you're missing one of those pieces, then it's not really doing much. Getting this 3/3 vigilance creature is not helping the deck very much. It's not a good attacker, it's not a good blocker, it's not doing what the deck wants. Yes, you can untap Nykthos with it for 1 turn, but it's not that great. And then there's of course cards like Lovestruck Beast and Polukranos Reborn. These are basically the extra copies of Old Growth Troll, where Old Growth Troll is obviously the best version of these effects, but these are just extra big creatures that you can play in addition to Old Growth Troll if you just want more big blockers. Now I think for the most part, these cards are the ones that are defensible in terms of if you play these. They're not great, but they're not like terrible either. The cards that are coming up are less so. So one of the things that the deck will often do is we'll play off-color walkers. So when Oath of Nissa was the only option for these decks, it meant that you could cast planeswalkers that aren't green via Oath of Nissa, or you could storm the festival into them. With Oath of Nissa, I think, being worse than Invasion of Ixalan, this plan gets much more dubious. But just to go over them, so Teferi Who Slows the Sunset was a great way of comboing with the Chain Veil, because his plus ability untaps artifacts and lands. So you could untap the Chain Veil and Nykthos with just Teferi, which meant that if Nykthos generated 6 mana, you could go infinite with Chain Veil and Teferi and gain infinite life off of his plus ability. Now that wouldn't actually win you the game on the spot, because you could still lose to something like, let's say, Lotus Field, but it would win you the game against most decks. However, again, as I've stated, I think Oath of Nissa is not that great and is just going to be replaced by Invasion of Ixalan, so this becomes a untenable card now. Another card that would often get played would be Nicol Bolas Dragon God, and this would essentially be sort of another copy of Sky Sovereign, essentially, where the -3 can destroy a creature. The problem is this card was never very reliable or that good to begin with. One of the things that makes Sky Sovereign so good is that you can crew it and attack them, so this one card can potentially take out multiple creatures, whereas Nicol Bolas Dragon God is not doing that. And also Nicol Bolas could come down minus and destroy something and then just die immediately. I tried playing Nicol Bolas, I don't think it was very good. I also tried playing Voyaging Satyr, so obviously if the main plan of the deck is untapping Nykthos a bunch, why don't we play this instead of like Sylvan Caryatid and untap Nykthos? And the problem is, similar to Sylvan Caryatid, it's a numbers game where being at 2 mana instead of 1, so your creatures are very vulnerable to removal. And in the case of Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystic, it's worth it because getting from turn 1 mana to turn 3, turn 2 playing Kiora a turn earlier or playing Karn a turn earlier or whatever, that can be very worthwhile. Whereas playing Voyaging Satyr on turn 2 is a lot less so and is even more vulnerable to removal. I tried it and it just basically felt like a win more most of the time. So then of course going back to the fighting cards, in the earlier days of the deck, a lot of times people would play either the OG Polukranos or Voracious Hydra as these like big green creatures that if you had a bunch of mana with Nykthos, you could dump into them and they could fight something. And the problem with both of these cards is that they just cost way too much mana. So the problem with Nykthos ramp is not that you don't have good things to play when you have a bunch of mana. That's not the issue. The issue is, what are you doing doing with your mana when you don't have that much of it and you need to play cheaper things to help stabilize you into the late game. Polukranos and Voracious Hydra are definitely not it. So Voracious Hydra, if you think about this, if you have between, let's say, 4 and 6 mana, is casting a 2/3 Voracious Hydra that's going to fight something for 2 damage useful? Is playing Polukranos, passing the turn, and then putting all of your mana in his ability to deal 2 damage to something useful? No, it's not. These cards were only ever good when you had a ton of mana to dump into them, at which point you may as well be doing something better. And lastly, so if aggro is such a big issue, why don't we just play Ugin the Spirit Dragon? I mean, we're already playing a Cityscape leveler in our main deck, so why not just play this and be able to minus and kill everything? And the problem is that it's also wiping out all of our own permanents. So just like Karn Sylex, it is exiling all of our own permanents, all of our Elves, all of our Old Growth Trolls, Kioras, Wolfwillow Havens. It exiles all of them along with it. Now, I do think this is worth testing at least, in that it's kind of similar to Karn Sylex, where even if it is getting rid of all of our stuff, just having a big end game bomb that can go down and sweep the whole board of all the aggro creatures, that could be useful, and then you could just win with Ugin alone. But it is basically conflicting with the deck's plan of getting a bunch of green permanents for devotion. So lastly, I want to talk about the mediocre sideboard options. So there are a lot of potential artifacts that you can play in your sideboard for Karn to go get, and I see lots of players playing these cards. So let's talk about the cards that you can play in your sideboard and why you really shouldn't. So first is Darksteel Citadel / Treasure Vault, and this is basically if you have Karn and you need to get another land. You might not have Nykthos and maybe you only have 4 lands and you have 5 drops in your hand like Cavalier, so you just want to go get another land so that you can have 5 lands next turn to play those cards. And the issue here is that the times when that is the case is very few, whereas a card that you would want over one of these cards is a lot more so. So it's pretty rare for you to be in the exact situation where you have Karn but not Nykthos, or not the green pips for Nykthos, and exactly 4 lands and exactly a 5 drop in your hand that you want to be able to cast next turn, so that would be specifically Cavalier in most cases. There's also the potential option of Treasure Vault in order to generate black mana, so if you need the black mana for Pestilent Cauldron during your combo turns, you could play Treasure Vault and then sack it for the treasure tokens. The problem here is that's not reliable, because a lot of the times on your combo turns you need to play a land in order to get going, or maybe you need to play the second Nykthos in order to generate enough mana, so you will not always have a land drop for Treasure Vault. Next is Esika's Chariot, and the idea here is that this card is either good at stabilizing against aggro because you can Karn for it, play it, and then you have 2 blockers, or good against like a mid-range value deck like Rakdos, because you can Karn for it and then you get 2 different cat threats, and if you ever crew this you can copy the cats. And the problem is that once again, Nykthos ramp is not really a good aggressive deck, so it's not good as an attacker, and playing 2 bears is terrible as a blocker against aggro decks. Again, I've tried this many times, this card just always sucks. So then there's Heart of Kiran, and the idea here is it provides a couple of things. So first of all, it's cheap, which means you can generally play it if you have Karn into it, even without a bunch of Nykthos mana. And because it's a colorless blocker that can crew based on removing loyalty counters from your Planeswalkers, you can block either flying creatures or you can block when your opponent has Brave the Elements. And lastly, if you have Heart of Kiran, it means that when you're going off on your Restorative Burst combos, you only need 1 copy of Kiora and Karn, because you can use Heart of Kiran's crew ability to continuously remove counters from those walkers to put them in the graveyard, so that Restorative Burst can fetch them back, so that you don't need a second copy of either of those walkers. And the problem is here that, again, these situations usually just do not play out like that. Having a single blocker, even if it is flying and colorless, against the aggro decks is not good enough, and being able to remove counters so that you need fewer copies of the Planeswalkers when you're burst comboing also just doesn't happen very much. So then there's Phyrexian Fleshgorger. So in the absence of Wormcoil Engine, this is the biggest lifelink threat that you can grab from the sideboard. And again, this looks like something that should be really good as a blocker against aggro decks, and it just isn't. First of all, your opponent having to pay life in order to target this is not a big deal, because the rest of your deck is not built to actually attack them and make that life payment punishing. They can easily afford to, for example, Brutal Cathar this, take 7. They don't care, they're at 13, you haven't dealt them any damage all game. And then secondly, unfortunately, once again, they just go too wide and too fast to the point where even a 7 power lifelinker is not necessarily going to stabilize you. So next is the Filigree Sylex, and the idea here is that you can again use this similar to Karn Sylex in order to blow things up. And the problem is that it just takes way too long to do anything with this. Basically, what are you destroying that's 0 mana? Or can you afford to wait 1, 2, 3 turns in order to tap this for counters and then be able to tap it and destroy everything of that specific value? It doesn't even destroy things of lesser value. So let's say your opponent has a bunch of 1 and 2 drops and you put this up to 2. You blow up their 2 drops, they still have all their 1 drops. And essentially, because of how slow this is, you may as well just play Karn Sylex. Karn Sylex is going to do exactly what this card is doing, but faster and better. So next are Transmogrifying Wand and the Might Stone and Weak Stone. And these are essentially removal spells that you can play when Sky Sovereign isn't going to do the job for whatever reason, which is basically when the creature either has more than 3 toughness, so Sky Sovereign's bolting it doesn't do anything, or in the case of Transmog Wand, it just straight up kills anything. And the problem with these cards is, again, it's the same problem that Nicol Bolas Dragon God had, which is that paying all of this mana and a card in order to kill one thing is not very good. Now, I get Transmog Wand kills multiple things, but it also gives them 2/4 Oxes. So if you're playing against, for example, Mono White, and you bring in Transmog Wand and you blow up one of their creatures, but then you give them a 2/4, you haven't really done much. And Might Stone and Weak Stone -5ing something, so you kill one creature. So you had to Karn for this, pay another 5 mana, so you paid 9 mana total for this card, and you've killed one creature. And then it basically doesn't do anything else. You're essentially never drawing 2 cards off of it. And this 2 colorless ability that gives, I guess you can use to activate Nykthos, but you can't use it on anything else. This is not making up for the times when you're lacking enough mana off of Nykthos in the first place. And essentially, for the commonly played creatures in the format that Sky Sovereign doesn't kill, the only ones that you really need to kill are Shieldred and Thing in the Ice. Those are basically the only 2 commonly played creatures that you absolutely need to get rid of that Sky Sovereign doesn't. And I think those 2 cards alone do not make these cards worth it. I think these cards are generally bad overall. They're too inefficient, slow, and not worth the mana value that it takes to play them. And in 95% of cases, Sky Sovereign or Cityscape Leveler are just going to do what these cards are doing, but better. So then there's Weathered Runestone and Grafdigger's Cage. And again, you use these cards on what you'd expect. Graveyard hate, anti-library hate. So cards like Neoform, Indomitable Creativity, getting back Parhelion with Greasefang. These are cards that get shut down by Weathered Runestone and Grafdigger's Cage. The problem is that Weathered Runestone and Grafdigger's Cage also shut down Storm the Festival, and that is a big deal. So the only way that I would play these 2 cards is if a deck picks up in popularity where you specifically need one of these cards in order to beat it. So for example, the Garuda combo decks. So for Garuda combo decks, traditional Graveyard hate doesn't actually stop them because of the way Garuda's ability is worded. The only thing that actually stops Garuda is cards like Weathered Runestone and Grafdigger's Cage. But I mean, Garuda is an extremely small part of the metagame. It's a fringe deck. Hardly anyone is even playing this. So unless a deck like this becomes a lot more popular, there's really no reason to run Weathered Runestone and Grafdigger's Cage and disrupt your own game plan by stopping Storm the Festival. So then there's the Immortal Sun, and this would be anti-Planeswalker effect. So essentially a Stax card for blue-white control decks to stop Teferi from being activated, to stop the Wandering Emperor. So the problem is twofold. So first of all, your own combo involves using Karn and Kiora, and having an Immortal Sun in place stops you from activating those. So it's the same sort of issue as Grafdigger's Cage and Weathered Runestone that I just spoke about. The second problem is that basically the only decks that are playing enough Planeswalkers for this to matter is blue-white control specifically. So this is a card that only harms those decks, and against those decks, they're white decks that are playing white exile-based removal. They're playing cards like Leyline Binding, like March of Otherworldly Light, cards that can get rid of the Immortal Sun. Specifically, Farewell is a card that's played in those decks, and that will get rid of Immortal Sun regardless anyway. And all of the additional effects of Immortal Sun, like drawing an extra card, just do not make up for how much it cripples your own deck by being not able to activate Karn and Kiora. And then lastly, let's talk about Woodcaller Automaton. So this card is hypothetically good. It looks so good on paper. So you pay 4 mana for it, you get 2 additional green pips, and you untap Nykthos. You turn Nykthos into a creature and you untap it. That looks like it should be fantastic. You're untapping Nykthos, which is what you want to do, and you're getting more green devotion, which is what you want to do. Isn't this a card that you should want to fetch with Karn? And the problem is, not really. And it's kind of the same issue as Heart of Kiran, where there's no point in your combo turns where you can afford to use Karn to get this rather than something else. So typically, you're either going to be able to combo off or not, and the 2 extra green devotion that this is adding for you is not going to be enough of a reason to have to Karn for this. So wrapping up, that is every super in-depth thing I can think of for Nykthos ramp. It's a deck that I have the most experience with in Pioneer. I've talked about every little tip and trick I can think of and all the little corner case scenarios that you need. Right now, this is the version of the deck that I'm testing, so some notable things are getting rid of any graveyard hate in the sideboard like Tormod's Crypt, because I don't think they're that useful, putting Haze of Pollen in to stop aggro, and main decking Sky Sovereigns instead of playing cards like Pelucranos or Lovestruck Beast as a way to answer aggro decks. I'll see how this turns out. I also want to experiment to see if maybe one of Ugin over one of these Sky Sovereigns is good against aggro decks, but this is basically where I'm at for the moment. So if you made it this far, I thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoy these videos, consider supporting the channel, and as always, here are a list of my supporters, and take care.